Well, guys, it's been 2 weeks since we started school, and we have at least one more week of virtual school for all of us, and some of you are going to stay virtual probably. But I'm glad for what we've learned so far and looking forward now to really starting teaching. We've spent a while in the last couple of weeks looking through some tools, trying to reacquaint ourselves with what our English class is supposed to be about, how to write a paragraph and stuff. And now we're actually going to start digging in and learning some new cool stuff. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint. This is what you should consider a mini lesson. Today, it's basically watch this video and answer a few quick questions about it, and that's your lesson. And then in the days to come, about 3 weeks now, we'll really work through each part of it. So we're going to start talking about something called signposts, something we call notice and note. How many of you like to read? Well, whether you like to read or not, one of the things that we want to be teaching in my class is how to do more than just read the words on the page, but actually think about what's being said, thinking about what the author of the story wants you to notice. So we're going to use something called signposts or notice and note and walk through that together and what it means. So let's turn over to this screen and see what we have to look at. Okay, can you see me? Okay. Signposts are signals from the author to stop and think about what is happening in the text that you are reading. So you're reading along, it's an exciting story, it's fun, you're laughing, and all of a sudden you should notice something that's a little bit different. And when you notice this, we call it a signpost, a sign, something you look at and you say, whoa, the author is trying to tell me something. Signposts are signals from the author to stop and think about what is happening in the text that you are reading. What kind of signposts are we talking about? Well, glad you asked. I have a few examples. First of all, the signpost that we're going to learn first is called a contrast and contradiction signpost. You stop and notice and note when you're reading and a character says or does something that's the opposite, it contradicts what he's been saying or doing all along. And when you see this happening, this contrast or contradiction signpost, you stop and you ask yourself, why is the character doing that? Whoa, Mr. Lyon, that's a lot. Just one slide, and we have 6 more slides to go through. I just want you to get the idea about what we're talking about. You don't have to memorize them all right now. That'll come later. But this first signpost, contrasts and contradictions. It's red. We abbreviate it with a CC. And the key question is, why is the character doing that? It's different than I expected. The next one is called an aha moment. You stop and you notice a note when you're reading along and suddenly a character realizes, understands, or finally figures something out. So this aha moment, this turning point or climax, you stop and you notice and you note and you ask yourself this question, how might this change things? That's the second signpost, an aha moment. The next signpost is tough questions. Stop and notice and note when you're reading and the character asks himself a really difficult question. What kind of difficult question? A question like, what could I possibly do to, or I couldn't imagine how I could cope with, or how would I ever understand why she, or never had I been so confused about, or I wonder. When there's a really tough question, there's a challenge. We call this the conflict, the tough question signpost. And you ask yourself, what does this question make me wonder about? Next signpost, words of the wiser. Words of the wiser signpost. You stop and you notice and you note when you're reading, and a character who's probably older and lots wiser takes the main character aside and gives serious advice. So this question, the words of the wiser, this signpost, you need to ask yourself the question, what's the life lesson and how might it affect the characters? This is the message of the story. This is the message of what you're reading, the theme of the message, words of the wiser. Stop and ask yourself, whoa, what's this life lesson? How might it affect the character? Next signpost, again and again. You stop and you notice and you note when you're reading and you notice a word, a phrase, an object, or a situation that's mentioned over and over again. This means that it's a word or a phrase used in an odd way repeatedly in the story, or an image or object reappears several times in the story, in the book. An event might happen several times, and you ask yourself, why does this keep happening again and again? The again and again signpost. Finally, this is almost finally, stop and notice and note when you see a memory moment signpost. The memory moment signpost. We sometimes call this a flashback. You're reading and the author interrupts the action in the present time to tell you about a memory. And so when you see this flashback, when you see a memory moment, the signpost, you ask yourself, why might this memory be important? Here's our last one, and we kind of tacked this one out on at the end because this one's really subjective. It's up to the person reading it to really notice it. But this signpost is called the language linger. You stop and notice and note when the author writes so artfully, so beautifully, so creatively that it makes you want to stop and think about their language. Linger on their language. You know what linger means? It means to wait, to pause, to hesitate. So sometimes some words will just be beautifully used, maybe a poem or something, and you're like, wow, that's really beautiful. I'm going to pause. So when you come to a language linger signpost, you ask yourself, what makes this part of my reading so interesting? That, my friends, is our little introduction to signposts. So here are the key points. What are the signposts? What are signposts? They're signals from the author to stop and think about what is happening in the text you are reading. Because you remember, when we're in a good story, we kind of forget about the author, but the author is putting those words on paper to make you think something, feel something, learn something. And so the signposts are things the author puts into the text to make you stop and say, whoa, what's happening here? Why did the author put this in here? Signposts are signals from the author to stop and think about what is happening in the text you're reading. And how many signposts did we cover today? How many are there? There are 7. There's 6 plus the language language linger. So there are 7 signposts we'll be looking at in the next 2.5 to 3 weeks. Thanks for listening. Go and do the Google Form project, and I'll see you tomorrow.